All right, let's get started on talking about Express.js. So we've introduced Node, which is a what? What is Node.js? We describe Node as
Framework.
not the words I used. Runtime environment, thank you. Node is a runtime environment so that you could run JavaScript on the server. Okay, and then we said NPM, which stood for Node Package Manager, even though we discussed the nuance there, and how NPM allows us to manage packages of software that other people wrote, and we can bring them in to our software using the command line tools, the database, which is the registry, and the website, which is npmjs.org. Okay, now we're going to talk about one of the most popular packages on npmjs.org is Express. Express allows us to create and configure a web server. Okay, remember a web server hosts a resource and the client wants the resource. So client server is a relationship. The client says, I want something. The server typically has it and responds with it. Okay, essentially with Express, we're going to build a web server that will allow us to build an API. Okay, now a web server typically, web servers oftentimes host HTML files and they host CSS files and JavaScript files. But when we start using things like an API, we use the language of an API. An HTML file, ultimately it's a user that's going to view the HTML, right? An API is not meant for consumption by a user directly. APIs are consumed by other pieces of software. Okay, so that's just whatever. Express is going to allow us to create APIs, which will then be used and consumed by like your front end React to display the information. Okay, regardless, Express allows us to create a web server, allows us to create an API. Express is made up of three main parts: routing, middleware, and a view or template engine. Again, this routing will allow us to have what are called endpoints that are used. HTTP will navigate to the endpoints and serve up a resource. And so you can kind of scroll up on this document and get into, what is a web server? Web server is a software program that uses HTTP to serve up files in the form of web pages to users. So Express will allow us to serve up web pages to users. A web server is also the physical computer itself. So a lot of times you use this term server. It can represent the software or the hardware. A web server, the physical server itself, needs to remain powered on 24/7. It's not like your laptop. Your laptop you power down, you disconnect it from the internet. A physical web server needs to stay connected and powered on all the time. Okay, and it runs a piece of software. So ultimately, we're going to deploy our software to a physical box that remains powered on all the time, and that physical box will be in Google's infrastructure in G Cloud. Okay, so that's your web server. A web server has a few functions. It handles HTTP requests. Again, the client says, I want a web page, and it typically says, I want http://whatever.com. So the client basically requests something via HTTP. The server then processes that request and sends back an HTTP response. So it's just a real simple life cycle. HTTP request comes into the server does something, does some work, and then the server sends back a response. Sometimes that response is static, like HTML, CSS. files. Sometimes it's dynamic, like you go hit a database and you pull some dynamic information out of the database, like what is the 10-day forecast? Or what is the hourly forecast? Well, that's dynamic. Depending on the hour that you request it, it's going to hit a database request and send back some dynamic content. Okay, so, all right. Express allows us to create a web server. That web server is going to handle HTTP requests and responses. So with those HTTP responses, you guys have all seen like 404 file not found, status codes, right? Shake your head if you've heard of the 404 file not resource not found, right? So most of us have heard that. A status code of 200 is okay. Okay, so Express will create the web server, and that's what Express will allow us to do. Handle HTTP requests and responses that allow us to have, in this case, dynamic content, not just static HTML. What does that allow us to do? That allows us to build web applications. A web client is just, again, a client server is a relationship. So a client typically says, hey, I want the resource that you have. So the client sends the HTTP request, typically via a web browser, but it could be via a mobile app, desktop apps, TV apps, refrigerator apps, Android Auto apps, etc. You can also have some testing tools. We're going to use this tool in this class called Postman, right? This is a tool right here. I'll give a little tutorial on it later, but Postman is a tool that's kind of, I've heard it called like a browser on steroids. It's kind of like a supercharged browser that's going to allow us to make these requests and these various types of requests a lot easier than using a web browser itself. Okay, let's spin up an Express demo, and I've kind of already done this a little bit. Express demo. What was the command that we used in npm to allow us to download some dependencies? What was the first command that we learned?
npm I express.
Before that one, before the install command.
-y.
npm init-y is the switch that you put on that command to kind of autofill boilerplate information. That brings in package.json. That allows us to install Express. npm I express. Can you guys see that terminal window okay? It's kind of small, but the commands are simple enough. Okay, that brings in node modules. That's all the dependencies. That can be a bigger download. You don't typically put node modules on GitHub, right? Node modules is a big download file. You want to use that in your git ignore. You do not want to put node modules on GitHub. Notice our file here, if I zoom in, that says our main file is called index.js. So I'm going to make a script called my start script. And this is going to run node mon index.js. Now I don't have an index.js file.
And then you exit out of the JS.
I'm also going to add the type of module here so that we can use the import syntax, not the require syntax. So if I go ahead and I make my index.js file, and let's go to npmjs.com. Let's search for Express, lowercase e because capital E messed it up, right? And let's go to the Express docs. Like, let's go to the documentation for Express. Now here, notice this is using the require syntax. So this is common JavaScript. But if I go to the getting started and I go to hello world, nope, this is still common JS. So let's copy this example. This is actually on the home page. Let's paste this in to my index.js. You guys can see that okay? Now I'm going to run my script, which I called the start script. How do I run a script in this package JSON? What was the command? npm run start. Okay, now I changed the type to module, but I'm using require, so I can undo that. Because I thought that I was going to be using. Now notice, example app listening on port 3000. I've got a web server booted up. It's going to respond to HTTP request via the browser. Localhost 3000, we get hello world. We're using nodemon so that anytime I change my source code, Control S, it reboots my server. You can make this a clickable link by doing http://localhost:3000. Now, just by putting that HTTP right there, and this is a template string, I can click it here and it brings up in the browser. Now, you might be wondering, if we break this down, you know, this require is importing a function called Express, right? We're running that function on line 2. So we import a function called Express. We run that function on line 2 to make this variable called app. We define a port on line 3. This is one route. Remember, Express allows us to have routing. This is a route. This is the syntax for creating a get route. So this is an HTTP get verb. I briefly want to discuss HTTP get verbs, right? So HTTP is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. There are built-in verbs or actions that are typically performed in HTTP. So an HTTP GET typically says, give me some information. I'm trying to retrieve information. A post is creating something new. Think of like you're registering on a website as a new user. You post your information to the server. Is like adding a new user to the website. So get is a retrieval. Post is creating one new resource. A put is updating a resource, and of course a delete would be deleting a resource. And so these are some different routes. If you get /users, that's going to get your user list. If you post to users, that might be adding one new user. If you put to user and give them their user ID, that's going to be updating a user. So these are your typical HTTP verbs, along with some routes that we will end up creating in Express. Okay, so this allows us to create a route using this syntax, app.get. Notice in this get method, there's two arguments. The first argument is the path. This just says the root path. So localhost, the root of localhost. And then the second is an anonymous function. This anonymous function takes two inputs, a request object, REQ, and a response object, RES. This is a very normal syntax. And then in this case, res.send says the response goes back to the client and send a string that says whatever this says. Now we're going to be modifying this with some different code as we go along, but this is good enough for the hello world. And then app.listen is a function that essentially boots up, starts the app, and listens on port 3000 and logs to the console this piece of text right here. So you can obviously say when you run the index.js, you actually see the output of this to boot up the web server. And then a request comes in from a client to the root of the web server. So I think of this as kind of booting Express. So this boots up Express, and this responds to a request at the root URL. So you've seen how to create a default route. We will create some different routes. I need to demonstrate this topic of middleware, which is another thing that Express is very commonly used for. And then we're actually not going to use Express for our, what's referred to as our view. The view is the front end. We're not going to use Express for the front end. We're using React for the front end. So React is another tool that we're going to use to show our front end off. And so if I wanted to maybe have a post, so you could do app.post. If you were to post to the root, rec.res, and I'm just showing this doesn't really, if you send a GET request to the root, it responds with one thing. If you were to send a POST request, we would add a new user or something to that extent. Add a new resource at the POST URL. All right, I'm going to have another lecture a little bit on Express middleware because that's a whole topic in itself. But if you think of the client request and then the server response, that's called a round trip. So middleware is just a function that runs in between the round trip. The client says, give me something, and then Express runs some functions in the middle before it sends back a response. That's all middleware is a function that runs in between the request-response lifecycle. Middleware literally means anything you put in the middle of one layer of software and another. Express middleware are functions that execute during the lifecycle of a request. That's what I more or less just said. And so express.static, and there's all sorts of reasons we use Express middleware examples, serving static files, which we can kind of go back here to the static files under the documentation. Now that we've got installation down, we've got hello world down, jump ahead to routing. This is a GET request at the root. This is a post request at the root. Remember, put is an update. So this would allow us to update the user. This would allow us to delete the user. So you put the route in the first argument. You put the verb right here. And these are different. We could literally copy and paste these in. But here is a little function built in to serve up static files. And so in the lab, I have you guys using React to build a front end in React. And then I have you serve a static file using this app.use. It looks something like this. And so that would say that anything that is inside of a public folder would be served up as static files. And I'll have to do another demo of that because I know I do that in the video for the lab. Okay. Node is a runtime environment. NPM is a command line tool for installing packages. Express is a web server that helps us build APIs. I'm trying to get into the weeds a little bit and review and keep it at a high level. Okay? So that is an introduction to Express. Questions? Yes?
Question. I've always been sure because I had done it, but like get post and all of them, like
Yes.
there's nothing special about like about getting a dot post. Like I can send a get request as like a dot post if I really want.
You can, but you obviously
You
shouldn't.
But there's no like difference between the actual functions.
No, it's just what the client sends, the server has to expect.
Yeah.
So, yes. Good question. Yeah, because it's like, hey, you're basically doing the same thing here, right? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I think I've actually done that before, but I was unsure.
Yeah. Okay, we'll stop it here.